After 30 years of putting my family first, helping with college tuition, wedding expenses, and every crisis in between, my son Jim looked me straight in the eye and said, "Mom, you're taking up too much space in our new house. Maybe it's time you found your own place." I had been living with them for barely 3 months since Frank passed away. 3 months of cooking their meals, watching Connor after school, and keeping their house running while they built their perfect life. But what Jim didn't know was that I had been keeping receipts, not just the financial ones, but the emotional ones too. And I was about to present him with a bill he never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, but everyone calls me Maggie. At 62, I never imagined I'd be starting over, but here I am, sitting in my favorite corner of this little coffee shop in Tempe, Arizona, watching the morning sun paint the desert, mountains in shades of pink and gold. It's been exactly 1 year since everything changed, and I'm finally ready to tell you how I went from being the family safety net to finding my own ground to stand on. Frank and I had been married for 38 years when his heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in March. One minute he was laughing at something on the morning news. The next he was gone. Just like that. The doctors said it was quick, painless, but that didn't make the silence in our little ranch house any easier to bear. We had built a good life together in this desert town. Nothing fancy, but solid. Frank worked construction. I taught elementary school until Connor was born, and I became the full-time grandmother. We paid off our mortgage, saved what we could, and always helped our family when they needed it. Jim was our only child, and from the day he was born, he was our whole world. Maybe that was our first mistake. We gave him everything we could, sometimes more than we should have. When he wanted to go to Arizona State for business, we took out a second mortgage to help with tuition. When he married Ashley, we paid for half their wedding because her parents couldn't contribute much. When they wanted to buy their first house, we gave them $15,000 from our retirement savings for the down payment. "It's an investment in our family," Frank used to say, and I believed him. I wanted to believe him. The pattern continued after Connor was born. Every time Jim and Ashley hit a rough patch financially, we were there. Car repairs, medical bills, daycare costs when Ashley decided to stay home and start her lifestyle blog. We never asked for anything back, never expected anything but gratitude. And for a while, that seemed like enough. I loved being needed, loved being the person they could count on. It made me feel valuable, important, like I was doing what mothers and grandmothers were supposed to do. But somewhere along the way, that gratitude started feeling more like expectation. Sunday dinners at our house became assumed rather than invited. Babysitting Connor became my responsibility rather than my pleasure. When Ashley's blog started making some money and they began talking about upgrading to a bigger house, I was happy for them. I really was. They had worked hard, and they deserved nice things. What I didn't expect was how quickly everything would change once they got them. The house in Scottsdale was beautiful, I'll give them that. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a 3-car garage, and a backyard with a built-in pool that sparkled like a jewel against the desert landscape. Ashley posted pictures of every room on her Instagram, hashtagging about blessed family life and new beginnings. Jim was proud, showing me around like he was giving a tour to a potential buyer, pointing out the granite countertops and stainless steel appliances like they were trophies he'd won. Frank had been gone for just 2 months when they moved in. I was still sleeping in our bedroom, still reaching for his coffee cup in the morning before remembering it would stay empty. The house felt enormous without him, every creak and settle amplified by the silence. That's when Jim made his first suggestion. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone in that big house," he said one Sunday after dinner. I had cooked pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, the whole spread. just like I had every Sunday for years. Why don't you come stay with us for a while, just until you figure out what you want to do next? It seemed like kindness then. My son, worried about his grieving mother, offering shelter and companionship. Ashley nodded along, adding how much Connor would love having Grandma around all the time. Even Connor, 16 and usually glued to his phone, looked up long enough to say it would be cool. So I packed a suitcase with a week's worth of clothes and toiletries, locked up the house Frank and I had shared for 22 years, and moved into their guest room. The first few weeks weren't bad. I helped with breakfast, drove Connor to school when Jim and Ashley were busy, kept the house tidy while Ashley worked on her blog content. She was always filming something, little videos about daily routines, product reviews, family life tips. I stayed out of the way during her recording sessions, but I could hear her cheerful voice echoing through the house, talking to her phone like it was her best friend. Good morning, beautiful people. Let me show you how I start my day in our gorgeous new kitchen. I fell into a routine quickly. Up at 6 to start coffee, breakfast ready by 7, Connor's lunch packed, dishes done before anyone else was fully awake. After school, I'd help Connor with homework while Ashley edited videos and Jim made calls to potential clients. Dinner was always my responsibility, and I didn't mind. Cooking for people I loved had always brought me joy. But slowly, quietly, I began to notice that my presence was being taken for granted rather than appreciated. Mom, can you grab some groceries on your way back from taking Connor to practice? Became, Mom, we need groceries. Would you mind watching Connor while we go out for dinner? Became, we're going out, Connor's all yours. The requests multiplied, and my time became theirs to allocate. I told myself this was normal, that this was what families did for each other. I was helping, I was needed, I was contributing. But deep down, something felt off balance. The guest room was nice enough, but it never felt like mine. Ashley had decorated it in shades of beige and white, very Instagram-worthy but completely impersonal. There was nowhere to put my things, no space for the framed photos of Frank and me that I had brought from home. When I asked if I could hang a few pictures, Ashley suggested I wait until I was more settled. When I asked about bringing over some of my books, she mentioned that they were trying to maintain a minimalist aesthetic. Slowly, I began to feel like a visitor in a space where I was supposed to be family. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in June. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I had spent the day deep cleaning their house, scrubbing bathrooms, mopping floors, organizing Connor's disaster of a bedroom. Ashley had a video call with some brand sponsors, and she wanted everything perfect in the background shots. I didn't mind the work. It kept my hands busy and my mind occupied. But when I overheard her telling the sponsors about her perfectly organized home and efficient daily routines, never once mentioning the hands that actually did the organizing, something inside me twisted. That evening, Jim asked if we could talk. We sat on their back patio, the pool lights casting blue ripples across the desert landscaping. He had a beer, I had iced tea, and the conversation started casually enough. How was I settling in? Was I comfortable? Did I need anything? But then his tone shifted, became more serious, more businesslike. Mom, Ashley and I have been talking, he began, and my stomach dropped. Nothing good ever started with those words. We love having you here, but we think it might be time for you to consider your long-term plans. I set down my iced tea, the glass sweating in the desert heat. What kind of long-term plans? Well, you can't stay in the guest room forever. Connor's growing up. He needs more space. Ashley's business is expanding. She needs an office. And honestly, this house was designed for our family size. He avoided my eyes, focusing instead on the pool's surface. There are some really nice senior communities nearby, places where you'd have your own space, activities with people your age, maybe even make some new friends. Senior communities. The words hit me like a physical blow. I was 62, not 92. I was healthy, independent, capable of living on my own. But more than that, I was his mother, the woman who had sacrificed and saved and supported him through every challenge of his adult life. And he was talking about shuffling me off to a retirement home like I was an inconvenience that needed managing. I have my own house, I said quietly. The house your father and I bought. The house where you grew up. Jim's expression grew uncomfortable. Mom, that house is too big for one person. The utilities alone must be costing you a fortune. And the maintenance, the yard work, all those repairs that come with an older house. Wouldn't you rather have something smaller, more manageable? I studied my son's face in the patio lighting. When had he become so calculating, so focused on efficiency and cost-benefit analysis? When had I become a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved? Are you asking me to leave? I asked directly. No, Mom, that's not what this is about. But his quick denial felt rehearsed. We just want you to be happy, to have your own space, your own life. You've spent so many years taking care of other people. Maybe it's time you took care of yourself. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 months, I had been taking care of them, just like I had for the past 30 years. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, all while grieving the loss of my husband and adjusting to a completely different life. And now, when my services were no longer convenient, when my presence was interfering with their perfect family aesthetic, I was being encouraged to find my independence. That night, lying in the beige guest room that had never felt like home, I stared at the ceiling and let myself feel the full weight of what was happening. I wasn't just being asked to leave, I was being dismissed. After decades of being the family safety net, I had become the burden that needed to be managed. The realization was devastating, but it was also clarifying. For the first time in months, maybe years, I could see the situation clearly, stripped of all the justifications and gentle suggestions. I had spent so much of my life being what other people needed me to be. The supportive wife, the generous mother, the devoted grandmother, the reliable safety net. I had poured so much of myself into other people's dreams and goals that I had forgotten I was allowed to have my own. Frank's death had left me adrift, and I had grabbed onto my family like a life preserver, desperate for purpose and connection. But they didn't want a person, they wanted a service provider. And now that the service was becoming inconvenient, the provider was expendable. The next morning, I made breakfast as usual, but something had shifted. I watched Jim scroll through, his phone while eating the eggs I had cooked, Ashley staging coffee cups for her morning Instagram story, Connor grabbing his lunch and backpack without a word of thanks. I saw them clearly for the first time in years, not as the family I had devoted my life to supporting, but as people who had learned to take without giving, to expect without appreciating, to consume without considering the cost to others. After they left for their respective days, I sat in their pristine kitchen and made a phone call I should have made weeks earlier. Betty Martinez had been my friend for over 15 years, ever since she moved into the house 3 doors down, from Frank and me. She was a few years older than me, a widow herself, and she had always been direct in a way that sometimes stung, but was usually exactly what I needed to hear. "Maggie, honey, where have you been?" she asked when she heard my voice. "I've been checking on your house, picking up mail, but I haven't seen you in forever." "I've been staying with Jim and Ashley," I explained. Since Frank passed, they worried about me being alone. There was a pause, and I could practically hear Betty processing this information. "How's that working out for you?" The simple question opened a floodgate. I told her everything. The gradual erosion of boundaries, the growing list of expectations, the conversation about senior communities, the feeling of being a guest in my own family, Betty listened without interrupting, making small noises of understanding and occasional sharp intakes of breath. "Maggie," she said when I finished, "do you hear yourself? You've been their unpaid housekeeper and babysitter for 3 months. And now they're suggesting you'd be happier somewhere else. That's not family support. That's exploitation with a smile." Her words were harsh, but they rang true. I had been so focused on being helpful, on being needed, that I had missed the line between family support and family servitude. I had volunteered for the role, certainly, but that didn't make it right for them to accept it indefinitely without question or gratitude. "What should I do?" I asked, feeling lost and overwhelmed. "Come home," Betty said simply. "Come back to your house, your space, your life. And then figure out what you want, not what they need from you." That afternoon, while Jim was showing houses and Ashley was filming content in the backyard, I packed my single suitcase. It took less than 20 minutes to gather everything I had brought to their house. 3 months of living, and it all fit in one bag. That should have been a sign right there. Connor was in his room when I knocked on his door. He was sprawled across his bed, homework spread around him, earbuds. And when he saw me with my suitcase, he pulled out one earbud. "You leaving, Grandma?" "I'm going back to my house," I said. "But you know where to find me." He nodded, then surprised me by getting up and giving me a hug. It was quick, awkward the way 16-year-old hugs often are, but genuine. "Thanks for helping with my algebra," he said. "I actually understand it now." It was such a small thing, but it was the first expression of gratitude I had received in weeks. I held on to it as I walked downstairs and left a note on the kitchen counter. "For Jim and Ashley, gone home to check on things. We'll call later." Short, polite, giving them an out to interpret my departure as temporary if they wanted to. Driving back to my house in Tempe, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation. Not the dread of another day of unappreciated service, but actual curiosity about what I might find, what I might feel, who I might be in my own space again. The house looked exactly as I had left it, a little dusty, mail piled on the kitchen counter, but mine. Completely, unquestionably mine. I walked through each room slowly, reacquainting myself with the life Frank and I had built together. Our wedding photos on the mantle, my books on the shelves, his coffee mug still in the dish drainer where I had left it the day I packed my suitcase. Everything was smaller than Jim and Ashley's house, older, less impressive. But it was filled with memories and meaning, with evidence of a life lived rather than a lifestyle performed. In the backyard, I found Frank's pottery wheel in the garage, covered with a tarp and gathering dust. He had taken up pottery in retirement, finding peace in the rhythm of shaping clay with his hands. After he died, I couldn't bear to look at it. But now I pulled off the tarp and ran my fingers over the smooth metal surface. Maybe it was time to learn something new, to create something with my own hands instead of just maintaining what others had built. That evening, Betty came over, with a bottle of wine and a casserole. We sat on my back patio, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and I told her about my 3 months in Scottsdale. "You know what I think?" Betty said, refilling our wine glasses. "I think you've been so busy being useful that you forgot to be yourself. When Frank was alive, you two were partners. You made decisions together, supported each other, built a life together. But with Jim and Ashley, you were just the help. Appreciated when convenient, dismissed when not." Her words stung because they were true. I had been trying so hard to earn my place in their family that I had forgotten I already had a place. I was Jim's mother, Connor's grandmother, not by virtue of what I could do for them, but by virtue of who I was to them. And if they couldn't see that value, if they could only see me in terms of my utility, then maybe the problem wasn't with me. So what now? I asked. Betty smiled, raising her wine glass. Now you get to find out who Maggie Thompson is when she's not trying to be everything for everyone else. As the desert night settled around us, filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant hum of traffic, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. For the first time since Frank died, maybe for the first time in decades, I wasn't responsible for anyone else's happiness, success, or comfort. I was responsible only for my own. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. I didn't know it then, but that evening on my patio with Betty was the beginning of everything that came next. The phone calls, the revelations, the choices that would change not just my relationship with my family, but my understanding of what family really means. I was about to learn that sometimes the people who say they love you the most are the ones who see you the least. And sometimes finding your own voice means being willing to use it, even when it makes others uncomfortable. The guest room in Scottsdale had been beautiful, but it had never been mine. This little house in Tempe, with its outdated kitchen and its memories and its pottery wheel gathering dust in the garage, this was mine. And for the first time in months, maybe years, that felt like enough. The first week back in my own house felt like waking up from a dream I hadn't realized I was having. Every morning, I made coffee for one person instead of 4. I ate breakfast at my own pace, read the newspaper without someone asking me to drive them somewhere or help them find something. The silence wasn't the oppressive emptiness I had feared after Frank's death. It was peaceful, restorative. It was mine. But the peace didn't last long. On Thursday evening, my phone rang. Jim's name flashed on the screen, and I hesitated before answering. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, to avoid whatever conversation was coming. But I had never been one to dodge difficult moments, so I answered. "Mom? What's going on?" His voice had that edge I remembered from his teenage years, the tone that meant he was frustrated and looking for someone to blame. "You just left without really explaining anything." "Ashley's upset. Connor keeps asking where you went, and I don't know what to tell them." I settled into Frank's old recliner, the one that still smelled faintly of his aftershave. "I told you I was coming home to check on things. For a week? Mom, come on. This isn't like you." He paused, and I could hear Ashley's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "Look, if something's wrong, we can talk about it. But you can't just disappear like this. We're family." There was that word again. Family. Used like a trump card, a conversation ender, a justification for anything and everything. I had heard it so many times over the years, usually when Jim needed something from me. Family helps family. Family sticks together. Family doesn't keep score, but I was beginning to understand that in Jim's vocabulary, family seemed to be a one-way street. "I'm not disappearing," I said calmly. "I'm home. This is where I live, remember? The house your father and I bought. The house where you grew up. But what about our arrangement? You were staying with us. We were taking care of each other. Now Connor doesn't have anyone to help with homework. Ashley's stressed about managing everything alone, and I thought we had a good thing going. Taking care of each other." The phrase stuck in my throat. When exactly had Jim taken care of me during those 3 months? When had he noticed that I might be grieving, struggling, or simply tired? I couldn't remember a single instance where my needs had been considered alongside theirs. "Jim," I said slowly, "when you say we were taking care of each other, what specifically were you doing to take care of me?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally he spoke, his voice defensive. "We gave you a place to stay. We included you in everything. We made you part of our daily routine." I almost laughed. They had given me a place to stay in exchange for full-time housekeeping, cooking, and childcare services. They had included me in everything that required work from me. They had made me part of their daily routine as the person who handled all the tasks they didn't want to do themselves. "I see," I said. "And what would you like from me now?" "We'd like you to come back. The house feels different without you. Connor misses you," Ashley's overwhelmed. "And honestly, Mom, I'm worried about you being alone so soon after Dad died." There it was, the emotional manipulation wrapped in concern. The suggestion that I couldn't handle being alone, that I needed them more than they needed me. But I had been alone for a week now, and I felt more like myself than I had in months. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I'm doing fine here. Better than fine, actually. Mom, please, can we at least talk about this in person? Come over for dinner Sunday like we used to. Ashley's making your favorite lasagna." The irony wasn't lost on me. Ashley had never made lasagna in the 3 months I lived there. I had made lasagna, along with every other meal they ate. But now, when they wanted something from me, suddenly Ashley was cooking. "I'll think about it," I said, though I had no intention of going back to that house anytime soon. After I hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my living room, not bothering to turn on the lights. The conversation had left me feeling unsettled, but not in the way Jim probably intended. Instead of making me feel guilty or lonely, it had clarified something important. They missed what I did for them, not who I was to them. They wanted the service provider back, not the person. The next morning, Betty knocked on my door with 2 cups of coffee from the Starbucks down the street. She had a talent for showing up exactly when I needed her, as if she had some kind of sixth sense for when I was spiraling into my own thoughts. "You look like someone who's been having revelations," she said, settling into the chair across from me at my kitchen table. "Want to talk about it?" I told her about Jim's call, about the guilt and pressure wrapped up in concern and family obligation. Betty listened, occasionally shaking her head or making small sounds of disapproval. "You know what I think?" she said when I finished. "I think they've gotten so used to using you that they can't imagine functioning without you. But that's not your problem to solve, Maggie. That's theirs. But Connor really might need help with his homework. And Ashley does have a lot on her plate with her blog and everything." Betty fixed me with a look that was both kind and exasperated. "Honey, Connor is 16 years old. If he needs help with homework, his parents can help him or hire a tutor. Ashley's blog is her choice, her business. She can hire help or scale back her commitments. These are not your responsibilities." I knew she was right, but decades of being the family problem solver don't disappear overnight. I had trained them to depend on me, and I had trained myself to find value in being depended upon. Breaking that cycle was going to require more than just moving back to my own house. "I keep thinking about something Frank used to say," I said. "He'd tell me that I was so busy taking care of everyone else that I forgot to take care of myself. I used to think he was being dramatic, but maybe he saw something I couldn't." Betty reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Frank was a smart man. Maybe it's time you listened to him." That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went shopping for myself. Not groceries for the family, not supplies for someone else's project, but things I wanted. I bought new sheets in a color I loved, a novel I'd been wanting to read, and art supplies I hadn't touched since my teaching days. At the garden center, I picked out plants for the empty spots in my backyard, flowers that would bloom in the desert heat. As I was loading bags into my car, my phone buzzed with a text from Ashley. "Hi, Maggie. Hope you're doing well. Connor has a big history project due Monday, and he's really struggling. Could you maybe come help him this weekend? He learns so much better when you explain things." I stared at the message for a long moment. 2 weeks ago, I would have dropped everything and driven over immediately. The old Maggie would have felt guilty for not being available, would have worried about Connor's grades and Ashley's stress. But the new Maggie the one who was slowly remembering who she was outside of her usefulness to others, had a different response. I typed back, "I'm sure Connor can handle it with a little effort. Maybe Jim could help him? It would be good father-son. Time." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. My phone stayed silent for the rest of the day. Sunday came and went without the family dinner Jim had suggested. I spent the day working in my garden, reading my new book, and experimenting with watercolors I hadn't touched in 20 years. It was peaceful, fulfilling in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. But Monday brought a phone call that shattered that peace entirely. "Mom, we need to talk." Jim's voice was clipped, businesslike. "Can you come over tonight? There are some things we need to discuss." Something in his tone made my stomach clench. This wasn't the concerned son from our previous conversation. This was someone preparing for a confrontation. "What kind of things?" I asked. "Just come over. 6 o'clock. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone and wondering what I had done to deserve such coldness from my own son. But even as anxiety twisted in my chest, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe, finally, we were going to have an honest conversation about what had been happening. I arrived at their house at exactly 6 o'clock, parking in the driveway behind Jim's BMW. The front door opened before I could knock, and Ashley stood there with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hi, Maggie," she said, her voice artificially bright. "Come on in. Jim's in the living room." The house looked exactly as it had when I left, pristine and perfectly staged. But something felt different, charged with tension that hadn't been there before. Connor was nowhere to be seen, probably banished to his room for whatever conversation was about to happen. Jim stood as I entered the living room, but he didn't hug me or even smile. Instead, he gestured toward the couch like I was a business client rather than his mother. "Sit down, Mom. We need to clear the air about some things." I sat, folding my hands in my lap and waiting. Ashley perched on the edge of the armchair, her phone in her hand, and I wondered if she was recording this conversation for some future social media content about family drama. "I've been thinking about our situation," Jim began, pacing in front of the fireplace, "and I think there's been some miscommunication about expectations and boundaries." Expectations and boundaries. Corporate speak from my own son. I said nothing, just waited for him to continue. "When we invited you to stay with us, it was supposed to be temporary, a transition period while you figured out your next steps. But I think you might have gotten the wrong impression about it being a permanent arrangement." "I never said anything about permanent," I replied quietly. "In fact, I remember you being the one to suggest I consider senior communities." His jaw tightened. "That was a suggestion, not a demand. We were trying to help you think through your options." "And what are my options, according to you?" Ashley leaned forward, her voice taking on that fake sweet tone I had come to recognize as her manipulation voice. "Maggie, we love having you as part of our lives, but we need to be realistic about what works for everyone. This past week has been really hard on us, especially Connor. He's been asking when you're coming back, and it's breaking my heart to see him so confused." I looked at her, this woman who had never shown the slightest interest in Connor's emotional well-being when it interfered with her content creation schedule. "What does Connor say when you explain that I'm at my own house?" "He doesn't understand why you left so suddenly," Jim said. "He thinks he did something wrong." The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. Use the child's feelings as a weapon, make me responsible for his confusion and hurt. But I had been Connor's grandmother for 16 years, and I knew him better than they seemed to think I did. "Has anyone explained to Connor that I didn't abandon him? That I live 20 minutes away and he's welcome to visit any time?" Silence. Of course they hadn't explained that. It wouldn't serve their purpose. "Look, Mom," Jim said, his patience clearly wearing thin. Here's the bottom line. Either you're part of this family or you're not. Either you're committed to making this multi-generational living situation work, or you're going to keep running back to your house every time things get a little challenging. Multi-generational living situation. As if what I had experienced was some kind of intentional, mutual arrangement rather than unpaid domestic labor. What exactly would making it work look like? I asked. Ashley and Jim exchanged a glance, and I could see they had prepared for this question. We'd need some ground rules, Ashley said. Clear expectations about household responsibilities, schedules, that kind of thing. We were thinking we could write up a kind of family agreement so everyone knows what to expect. A family agreement, a contract for my place in their lives, spelling out exactly what services I would provide in exchange for the privilege of living in their guest room. The idea was so insulting I almost laughed. And what would this agreement include? I asked. Jim cleared his throat. Well, obviously, you'd need to be more communicative about your comings and goings. The disappearing act this week wasn't fair to any of us, and we'd need to establish some boundaries around Connor's schedule and homework time. Boundaries around Connor's schedule? You've been a little too involved in his schoolwork, Ashley said. We think it's making him too dependent on outside help instead of learning to be self-sufficient. This from the woman who had texted me begging for help with his history project just days earlier. I was beginning to see the full picture now. They wanted me available for labor when convenient, but not so involved that I might have opinions or form independent relationships with Connor. And household responsibilities? I asked. We'd need to be more systematic about dividing things. Up, Jim said. Maybe we could rotate cooking duties, have assigned cleaning days, that kind of thing. I almost believed him until Ashley added, Of course, you're such a natural at cooking and you seem to enjoy it, so it makes sense for you to handle most of the meal planning and preparation. There it was, the same arrangement as before, dressed, up in the language of fairness and cooperation. I would do the work, they would manage and supervise my doing of the work, and everyone would pretend this was an equitable family arrangement. I see, I said. And what would I get out of this agreement? They looked genuinely puzzled by the question, as if the answer should be obvious. You'd get to be part of a family, Jim said. You'd have people around you, activities, purpose. You wouldn't be alone in that big empty house. You'd get to watch Connor grow up, Ashley added. Be really involved in his life during these important teenage years. What they were offering me was the same thing I had already experienced. The right to serve them in exchange for proximity to them. The privilege of watching Connor grow up, as long as I didn't interfere with their parenting decisions. The comfort of not being alone, as long as I earned that comfort through constant usefulness. I stood up slowly, smoothing my skirt and picking up my purse. I need to think about this, I said. Mom, wait, Jim said, standing as well. We need an answer. Ashley and I are trying to plan our lives here, and we need to know if you're in or out. In or out. Like I was applying for membership in a club that might or might not accept me based on my willingness to follow their rules. I'll let you know, I said, walking toward the door. When? Ashley called after me. I turned back to look at them. These two people who had reduced my value as a person to a cost-benefit analysis. When I'm ready. The drive home was a blur of desert highway and gathering dusk. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, not from fear, but from rage. Pure, clean anger at the audacity of what they had just proposed. They wanted to formalize my servitude, put it in writing, make it official that my place in their lives was contingent on my usefulness to them. But underneath the anger was something else. Clarity. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I could see my situation without the fog of guilt and obligation and misplaced loyalty. I could see what I had become and what I had allowed myself to become. And I could see that I had a choice to make. I could go back to that house, sign their family agreement, and spend whatever years I had left being grateful for the scraps of affection they threw my way in exchange for my labor. I could be the grandmother who earned her place through service, the mother who bought love through sacrifice, the woman who disappeared entirely into her usefulness to others. Or I could choose something different. I could choose to be Maggie Thompson, not just Jim's mother or Connor's grandmother or Ashley's unpaid help, but a person in my own right, with my own dreams and goals and boundaries. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw Betty's porch light flick on. She emerged from her house as I got out of my car, crossing the small distance between our yards with the determined stride of someone who had been watching for my return. "How did it go?" she asked. "They want me to sign a contract," I said. And then, because the absurdity of it hit me all at once, I started laughing. Not happy laughter, but the kind that comes when something is so ridiculous you can't process it any other way. Betty's eyebrows shot up. "A contract?" "A family agreement, spelling out my responsibilities and boundaries and expected contributions to the household." I was still laughing, but tears were running down my cheeks now. "They want to put in writing exactly how I should earn my place in their lives." Betty's expression shifted from surprise to something much darker. "Those ungrateful little—" "No," I said, cutting her off. "Not ungrateful, honest. For the first time since this whole thing started, they're being completely honest about what they want from me and what they're willing to give in return." We stood in my driveway in the gathering darkness, and I felt something settle into place inside me, a decision I hadn't known I was making, crystallizing into certainty. "I'm not going back," I said. Betty nodded. "Good. I'm not signing their agreement. I'm not moving back into their guest room, and I'm not going to keep pretending that what they want from me is the same thing as love. Even better." I looked at my house, small and outdated compared to their Scottsdale showcase, but mine, completely, unquestionably mine. I think it's time I figured out who I am when I'm not trying to be everything for everyone else. Betty smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen all day. "Now you're talking." As we walked toward my front door, I felt lighter than I had in months. Tomorrow, I would call Jim and give him my answer. Tomorrow, I would start figuring out what my life looked like when it belonged to me. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of becoming someone I had never allowed myself to be. Enough, just as I was, without apology or justification or endless, thankless service to people who saw me as a means to an end rather than an end in herself. But tonight, I was going to sit in my own living room, drink tea from my own cups, and start planning a life that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations or needs or carefully written agreements about my place in their world. Tonight, I was going to remember what it felt like to be free. The morning after my confrontation with Jim and Ashley, I woke with the kind of clarity that only comes after you've finally stopped lying to yourself. I made coffee in my own kitchen, sat at my own table, and called my son to deliver the answer he'd been demanding. "I won't be signing your family agreement," I said when he answered. "And I won't be moving back into your guest room." The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. "So that's it? You're choosing to be alone over being part of this family?" "I'm choosing to be myself over being your employee," I replied. "Employee? Mom, that's ridiculous. We're talking about family contributions, shared responsibilities. Jim, in the 3 months I lived with you, name one thing you or Ashley did specifically for my benefit. One thing that made my life easier, rather than yours." Another long pause. "We gave you a place to stay. In exchange for full-time housekeeping, cooking, and childcare. That's not generosity. That's a transaction." I could hear Ashley's voice in the background, sharp and agitated, though I couldn't make out the words. "Fine," Jim said finally. If that's how you want to see it, fine. But don't come crying to us when you realize what you've given up. What have I given up exactly? Your family, Mom. Your place in Connor's life. Your chance to be part of something bigger than yourself. The manipulation was so blatant it was almost refreshing. No more pretense about concern for my well-being or happiness. This was about what I could do for them, and my refusal to do it was being framed as abandonment. I'll always be Connor's grandmother, I said. That doesn't require me to live in your guest room or sign contracts about my household duties. We'll see about that, he said, and hung up. The threat in those words was unmistakable. If I wouldn't play by their rules, they would limit my access to Connor. It was exactly the kind of emotional blackmail I should have expected, but it still hit me like a physical blow. They were willing to weaponize my relationship with my grandson to get what they wanted from me. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call, staring at the coffee growing cold in my cup. Part of me wanted to call Jim back, apologize, agree to whatever they wanted. The thought of being cut off from Connor was almost unbearable. But another part of me, a part that was growing stronger every day, whispered that giving in to threats would only teach them that threats worked. Betty found me there an hour later, having let herself in through the back door when I didn't answer her knock. "You look like someone who's been through a war," she said, settling into the chair across from me. I told her about the phone call, about Jim's final words and what they implied. Betty's face grew darker with each detail. "That boy needs a reality check," she said when I finished. "And Ashley needs to learn that not everything in life can be manipulated with a pretty smile and a social media post." But what if they really do keep Connor away from me? What if I lose him because I wouldn't play their game? Betty reached across the table and took my hands. "Honey, Connor is 16 years old. He's not a little boy they can control completely. And if they try to keep him from his grandmother out of spite, what does that teach him about how families should treat each other?" She was right, but it didn't make the fear any less real. I had missed too much of Connor's childhood already, distracted by Frank's illness and then my own grief. The thought of missing more because of his parents' petty revenge was devastating. But over the next few days, something unexpected happened. Nothing. No angry calls from Jim, no manipulative texts from Ashley, no dramatic social media posts about ungrateful mothers and family betrayal. The silence was almost worse than the confrontation because it left me wondering what they were planning. I found out on Thursday when my phone rang with an unknown number. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Principal Rodriguez from Connor's school. I'm calling because Connor listed you as his emergency contact, but when we tried to reach you at the number we had on file, it was disconnected." My blood ran cold. "What's wrong? Is Connor hurt?" "He's fine physically, but he's been having some behavioral issues this week. He's been disruptive in class, arguing with teachers, and today he was caught skipping his last 2 periods. We need a parent or guardian to come in for a meeting." "I'll be right there," I said, already reaching for my keys. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, we've already contacted his parents. His father is on his way. But Connor specifically asked us to call you too, and he seems quite upset. He keeps saying he needs to talk to his grandmother." I was in my car and driving toward the school before the principal finished explaining the situation. Something was wrong, something more than typical teenage rebellion. Connor had always been a good student, respectful to his teachers, responsible about his schoolwork. For him to suddenly start acting out meant something significant had changed. I arrived at the school just as Jim was walking out of the main office, his face thunderous. When he saw me, his expression shifted to something even darker. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "Connor asked them to call me. What's going on?" "What's going on is that you've upset him so much with your dramatic exit from our lives that he can't concentrate on school. He keeps asking when you're coming back, and when we try to explain that you've made your choice, He gets angry and defiant. Before I could respond, Connor himself appeared in the doorway of the office, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Grandma!" He ran over and wrapped me in a hug that was anything but awkward this time. "I knew you'd come." "Of course I came," I said, holding him tight. "Are you okay?" "I am now," he said, but I could feel the tension in his shoulders, see the strain around his eyes. Jim stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Connor, we're leaving. Now." "I want to talk to Grandma first," Connor said, not moving from my side. "You can talk to her later. Right now, we need to get home so your mother can hear about this school situation." "No," Connor said, and the defiance in his voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from him. "I want to talk to Grandma alone, just for a few minutes." Jim looked ready to argue, but Principal Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Thompson, why don't you handle the paperwork with me while Connor and his grandmother have a brief conversation? There are some forms we need to go over regarding the academic probation process." Academic probation. In 1 week, Connor had gone from being a solid B student to being on academic probation. Something was very wrong here. Jim shot me a warning, "Look," but followed the principal back into the office. Connor and I found a quiet corner in the hallway, away from the traffic of students and staff. "Tell me what's really going on," I said. Connor's composure cracked, and suddenly he looked like the little boy I remembered instead of the almost adult he was becoming. "They said you didn't want to be part of our family anymore," he said, tears starting to fall. "They said you chose, living alone over living with us, and that meant you didn't really love us enough to make it work." The cruelty of it took my breath away. They had twisted my decision to maintain my independence into evidence that I didn't love my own family. "Connor, that's not what happened," I said gently. "I love you more than you could possibly know. But loving someone doesn't mean you have to live in their house or follow their rules about how to be part of their life." "But why did you leave so suddenly? I came home from school and all your stuff was gone, and nobody would tell me where you went or why." "I went back to my own house, the house where your grandfather and I lived, where your father grew up. It's 20 minutes away from you, not 20 hours. He looked confused. "But Dad said you were cutting ties with us, that you wanted to start over without the burden of family obligations." Family obligations. They had described me as seeing my own grandson as a burden. The manipulation was so thorough, so deliberately hurtful, that I felt sick. "Connor, listen to me very carefully," I said, taking his hands. "You are not a burden. You have never been a burden. You are one of the greatest joys of my life, and nothing that's happening between me and your parents changes that. Then why can't things go back to the way they were?" How could I explain to a 16-year-old that the way things were had been slowly killing me? That his parents had been using both of us in different ways to maintain their perfect lifestyle? "Sometimes adults have to make difficult choices about how to live their lives," I said. "Your parents wanted me to live with you in a way that didn't feel healthy for me. That doesn't mean I don't love you, and it doesn't mean I'm not part of your life anymore." "Can I come visit you?" he asked. "At your house?" "Of course you can, anytime you want." "This weekend?" I hesitated, knowing this would probably cause another confrontation with Jim and Ashley. But looking at Connor's hopeful face, I realized I couldn't let their manipulation tactics control my relationship with my grandson. "This weekend," I agreed. Jim emerged from the office looking even angrier than before, if that was possible. Principal Rodriguez was behind him, and her expression suggested the conversation hadn't gone well. "Connor, car. Now," Jim said. Connor looked between his father and me, then made a decision that surprised everyone. "I'm going to ride with Grandma," he announced. "No, you're not," Jim said. "You're in enough trouble as it is." "I'm not in trouble for anything I did to hurt anyone," Connor shot back. "I'm in trouble because you lied to me and I was upset about it." The public nature of the confrontation was clearly embarrassing Jim, and he grabbed Connor's arm more roughly than necessary. "We are leaving, now." "Mr. Thompson," Principal Rodriguez interjected, "perhaps it would be beneficial for Connor to have some time with his grandmother. He's been asking for her all week, and it might help stabilize his emotional state." Jim's jaw clenched, but he was clearly unwilling to make more of a scene in front of the principal. "Fine," he said, "but he comes home by 6 o'clock. Connor brightened immediately, and I felt a small victory in the midst of all the chaos. As we walked to my car, Connor was quiet, processing everything that had happened. It wasn't until we were driving away from the school that he spoke again. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you lived with us, were you happy?" The question was so direct, so honest, that I had to think carefully about my answer. I didn't want to poison him against his parents, but I also didn't want to lie to him. "I was happy to be near you," I said finally. "But no, I wasn't happy with the situation overall. Because of the way they treated you?" Smart boy. Too smart to be fooled by his parents' version of events. "Because they needed things from me that I was willing to give, but they weren't willing to see me as a person with my own needs and feelings. Like how Mom always had you cooking and cleaning while she worked on her blog. You noticed that? It was pretty obvious. And Dad never helped with anything around the house because he said you were better at it and seemed to enjoy it." I was beginning to understand that Connor had seen much more than any of us had realized. 16-year-olds might seem self-absorbed, but they're also incredibly perceptive about the adults around them. "Is that why you've been having trouble at school?" I asked. I kept thinking about how they made you leave and how they lied to me about why you left, and I got mad. When I get mad, I can't concentrate on stupid stuff like algebra and history. We had reached my house, and Connor looked around with interest as we pulled into the driveway. He had been here countless times over the years, but somehow it looked different to him now. "This place feels more like you than their house ever did," he said as we walked to the front door. Inside, Connor wandered around like he was seeing everything for the first time. He stopped at the mantelpiece, studying the photos of Frank and me, pictures from his own childhood, memories of birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. "I miss Grandpa," he said suddenly. "I miss him too." "Do you think he would have liked the way Mom and Dad treated you?" The question caught me off guard. Frank had always been diplomatic about Jim's shortcomings, preferring to focus on his positive qualities rather than criticize. But I had a feeling that watching his wife being used as unpaid help would have stirred his protective instincts. "Your grandfather loved your father very much," I said carefully. "But he also believed that people should treat each other with respect and appreciation, especially family members." Connor nodded thoughtfully. "Can I see his pottery stuff? In the garage?" We spent the next hour in the garage, looking at Frank's pottery wheel and the pieces he had been working on before he died. Connor was fascinated by the half-finished bowls and vases, running his fingers over the smooth clay surfaces. "Could you teach me?" he asked. "How to make things like this?" "I don't actually know how," I admitted. "Your grandfather tried to teach me a few times, but I was always too busy with other things to really learn. Maybe we could learn together." The idea sparked something in me, a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in months. I'd like that. We were sitting on the floor of the garage, surrounded by Frank's tools and creations, when Connor said the thing that changed everything. "Grandma, I don't want to live with them anymore." I looked at him sharply. "Connor, that's a big statement. What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't like the way they treat people. I don't like the way they treated you, and I don't like the way they lied to me about it. I don't like how everything in our house has to be perfect for Mom's stupid videos. And I don't like how Dad talks to people like they're employees instead of family. They're your parents, Connor. They love you." "Do they?" Or do they love the idea of me, the way I fit, into their perfect family image? The question was so mature, so insightful, that it broke my heart a little. At 16, he was already learning to distinguish between being loved for who you are and being valued for what you represent. "What would you want instead?" I asked. "I want to live with you, at least until I graduate. I want to learn pottery and help you with your garden and not have to worry about whether I'm messing up somebody's Instagram aesthetic." The longing in his voice was unmistakable, but the implications of what he was suggesting were enormous. Legal custody battles, family court, lawyers, and a level of conflict with Jim and Ashley that would make our current situation look like a minor disagreement. "Connor, that would be very complicated. Your parents would never agree to it. What if I'm 18 in less than 2 years? What if I just refuse to cooperate with them until then?" I could see him thinking it through, planning a campaign of passive resistance that would make everyone's life miserable. It was exactly the kind of thing a smart, stubborn teenager would come up with, and exactly the kind of thing that would backfire spectacularly. "Let's not make any big decisions right now," I said. "Let's just focus on spending time together and figuring things out as we go." But as we sat there in Frank's garage, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived with creativity and purpose, I found myself thinking about possibilities I had never considered before. What if Connor could live with me? What if I could provide him with the kind of stable, loving home environment that valued him for who he was, rather than what he contributed to the family brand? It was a dangerous thought, the kind that could lead to a war I wasn't sure I was prepared to fight. But as I watched Connor examine one of Frank's finished pieces, his face peaceful for the first time since I'd seen him at the school, I realized that some wars might be worth fighting after all. The day was growing late, and I knew I needed to get Connor back to his parents' house before the 6 o'clock deadline. But as we cleaned up the garage and prepared to leave, both of us were quiet, lost in our own thoughts about what came next. "Grandma," Connor said as we got back in the car, said, "Whatever happens, I want you to know that I see you, not just as someone who does things for other people, but as a person who matters." I had to pull over because my vision blurred with tears. At 16, my grandson had managed to say the thing I had been trying to hear from the adults in my life for years. I mattered, not because of what I could do for others, but because of who I was. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he replied. As we drove back toward Scottsdale, I realized that the battle for my independence had become something bigger than I had expected. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Connor and what kind of family relationships he would learn to accept as normal. It was about showing him that love doesn't require servitude, that respect can't be earned through endless sacrifice, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's selfishness. And then Pari. Jim had threatened was coming whether I wanted it or not, but looking at Connor's reflection in the passenger window, I knew I was finally ready to fight it. The confrontation I had been dreading came 2 days later, and it arrived with all the subtlety of a desert thunderstorm. Jim and Ashley showed up at my door at 8 in the morning, faces set with the kind of determination that meant they had been planning this conversation for days. "We need to discuss what happened with Connor," Ashley said the moment I opened the door, not bothering with pleasantries. She pushed past me into my living room like she owned the place, Jim following close behind. "Good morning to you too," I said, closing the door and following them. "Don't," Jim said sharply. "We're not here for small talk. We're here because you completely undermined our authority as parents on Thursday, and it needs to stop." I settled into Frank's old recliner, the one that had become my refuge during difficult conversations. I picked up my grandson from school because he was in distress and specifically asked for me. "How is that undermining anything?" Ashley pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what looked like screenshots. Because you filled his head with ideas about living with you, instead of respecting our family structure. Because you made him think we were the bad guys for trying to maintain some boundaries after your dramatic exit from our lives. What boundaries would those be? I asked. The boundary that says we're his parents and you're his grandmother, Jim said. The boundary that says we make the major decisions about his life, not you. I looked at them both, these two people who had turned my love for my family into a weapon against me, and felt something shift inside me. For months, I had been defensive, trying to justify my choices and explain my perspective. But sitting in my own living room, surrounded by the life Frank and I had built together, I realized I was done explaining myself to people who had never tried to understand. You're absolutely right, I said calmly. You are his parents. So tell me, as his parents, what's your plan for helping him through this difficult time? They exchanged glances, clearly not expecting agreement. Our plan is to get him back into his normal routine, Ashley said. Remove the distractions that are causing him to act out, establish clear expectations for his behavior, and help him understand that there are consequences for his choices. And by distractions, you mean me. We mean the false hope that he can somehow escape the normal responsibilities of being part of this family by running to his grandmother every time things get challenging. The phrase hit me like a slap. False hope. As if my love for Connor, my willingness to listen to him and support him, was somehow damaging to his development. What responsibilities are we talking about exactly? I asked. Jim's jaw tightened. The responsibility to respect his parents, to follow the rules of our household, to understand that family comes first, even when it's inconvenient. Family comes first, I repeated. That's interesting. Coming from you? What's that supposed to mean? I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the desert landscape Frank and I had loved. The morning sun was already intense, promising another day of relentless heat. It means that for 30 years, I put family first. I put your education first when your father and I took out that second mortgage. I put your wedding first when we gave you money we couldn't really afford to spend. I put your house purchase first when we handed over $15,000 from our retirement savings. I put your convenience first when I moved into your guest room and became your unpaid housekeeper. I turned back to face them. And now, when I finally decide to put my own well-being first, you're telling me I've violated some sacred principle about family loyalty. So, forgive me if I find your definition of family first a little one-sided. Ashley's perfectly composed expression cracked slightly. We never asked you to sacrifice everything for us. You never asked because you never had to ask. I volunteered. I made myself available for every crisis, every need, every convenience. And you both learned that Maggie would always say yes. Maggie would always help. Maggie would always put everyone else's needs ahead of her own. And now you've decided to be selfish instead, Jim said. The word hung in the air between us like an accusation. Selfish. The ultimate condemnation for women of my generation, the word that had kept me in line for decades. Yes, I said simply. I have decided to be selfish. I have decided that my needs matter too. I have decided that love shouldn't require me to disappear. At the expense of your own grandson's emotional stability, Ashley said, her voice taking on that fake concerned tone I had learned to recognize. Connor's emotional instability comes from being lied to by parents who told him his grandmother abandoned the family rather than explaining that she chose to live independently. We were trying to protect him from the details of an adult conflict. You were trying to manipulate him into taking sides in a conflict you created. The conversation was escalating in exactly the way I had hoped to avoid, but I found myself caring less about keeping the peace and more about finally telling the truth. Here's what's going to happen, Jim said, his voice taking on the authoritative, tone he probably used with difficult clients. "You're going to explain to Connor that living with you is not an option. You're going to encourage him to respect our household rules and stop this rebellious behavior. And you're going to step back from trying to parent him. Or what? Or we'll limit your contact with him until he's 18 and can make his own decisions about relationships." There it was, the threat I had been expecting. My access to Connor held hostage to ensure my compliance with their demands. "I see," I said. "And what makes you think Connor will go along with being cut off? From me? Because he's 16 years old and we control his phone, his transportation, and his social activities," Ashley said. "If we decide he can't see you, he can't see you." I looked at them both, really looked at them, and saw something that chilled me. They weren't angry parents trying to protect their child. They were people who had been caught in their manipulation and were now willing to hurt their own son to maintain control of the situation. "You would really keep Connor away from his grandmother out of spite?" I asked. "We would keep Connor away from toxic influences that are undermining his development," Jim replied. Toxic influences. I had become a toxic influence for refusing to sign their family contract and return to unpaid servitude. "I think you should leave now," I said. "We're not finished with this conversation," Ashley said. "Yes, you are. This is my house, and I'm asking you to leave." They both stood, but neither moved toward the door. "Mom, you're making a huge mistake," Jim said. "You're throwing away your relationship with your only grandchild over your pride." "I'm protecting my relationship with my grandchild from parents who are willing to weaponize it." "Fine," Ashley said, pulling out her phone again. "But don't say we didn't warn you about the consequences." After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. They had given me an ultimatum: submit to their control or lose Connor. It was exactly the kind of emotional blackmail I should have expected, but experiencing it directly was still shocking. The phone rang around noon. It was Connor, and his voice was strained. "Grandma, they took my phone away, but I'm calling from school. Can you come get me?" "What's wrong?" "They told me I can't see you anymore unless I apologize for my behavior and promise to stop disrespecting the family." I told them I wasn't going to apologize for wanting to spend time with my grandmother, and Dad got really angry. My heart clenched. "Connor, I don't want you to fight with your parents because of me. It's not because of you, it's because of them. They're being controlling and manipulative, and I'm old enough to see what they're doing." "What are you asking me to do?" "I want to come live with you. I know it's complicated, but I can't stay in that house anymore. Every conversation is about how I need to fall in line and stop thinking for myself." I closed my eyes, knowing that what he was asking would change everything. Taking in Connor would mean an all-out legal battle with Jim and Ashley. It would mean court hearings, lawyers, family services investigations. It would mean burning bridges that could never be rebuilt. But it would also mean giving Connor a safe harbor in a storm that was only going to get worse. "Come to my house after school," I said. "We'll figure this out together." "They'll be furious." "Let me worry about that." Connor arrived at my house at 4 o'clock, carrying his school backpack and looking older than his 16 years. We sat at my kitchen table, and I made him a snack while we talked through the practical realities of what he was asking. "Do you understand what this would mean?" I asked. "Your parents would probably fight this legally. There would be court proceedings, investigations, a lot of conflict and stress." "I understand. But Grandma, I can't keep living in a house where love is conditional on perfect behavior and total compliance, where everything I say and do is managed for someone else's benefit." The maturity in his voice broke my heart. At 16, he was already recognizing patterns that had taken me decades to understand. "There's something else you need to know," I said. "If you come live with me, your life would be very different. I don't have unlimited money for activities and gadgets. I can't give you the same material advantages your parents can. I don't care about that stuff. I care about being able to breathe. Being able to breathe. He had just described exactly what I had been fighting for myself. Okay, I said. If this is really what you want, I'll support you. But we're going to do this the right way, legally and officially. His face lit up with the first genuine smile I had seen from him in weeks. Really? Really. But first, you need to go home and have an honest conversation with your parents about why you're unhappy. Give them a chance to make changes before we take drastic action. They won't change. They'll just get better at making me feel guilty for wanting things to be different. Maybe, but you'll know you tried, and that matters. Connor went home that evening to have what turned out to be a catastrophic conversation with Jim and Ashley. He called me at 9 o'clock, crying. It was awful, Grandma. Dad started yelling about how you were poisoning me against them. Mom started crying and saying I was breaking her heart. They said if I really loved them, I wouldn't even consider leaving. What did you tell them? I told them I did love them, but I couldn't live with the way they treated people. I told them about the family contract they wanted you to sign and how they lied to me about why you left. Dad said I was being manipulated by a bitter old woman who couldn't accept that her usefulness was expired. The cruelty of that phrase took my breath away. Jim had described his own mother as having expired usefulness, like I was a household appliance that had outlived its warranty. I'm sorry they said that to you, Connor. I'm not. It showed me exactly who they really are. The next morning, I called Betty and asked her to recommend a family law attorney. She gave me the name of someone she had worked with during her own divorce years earlier. Sarah Chen is tough but fair, Betty said. She doesn't play games, but she also doesn't create unnecessary drama. If anyone can help you navigate this situation, it's her. I made an appointment for that afternoon. Sarah Chen's office was in a modest building in downtown Tempe, far from the gleaming corporate towers where Jim conducted his real estate business. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her 40s, with kind eyes and a direct manner. That reminded me of Betty. "Tell me about your situation," she said after we had settled in her office. I explained everything: the months of unpaid labor, the family contract, the threats about limiting my access to Connor, and his request to come live with me. Sarah listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "This is complicated," she said when I finished. "Connor is 16, which means his preferences carry significant weight with a judge, but he's still a minor. His parents have legal custody, and courts are generally reluctant to change custody arrangements unless there's evidence of neglect or abuse." Is emotional manipulation considered abuse? It can be, depending on the severity and impact. But you'd need to document specific instances, and you'd need Connor to be willing to testify about his experiences. He's willing. That's good. But I have to warn you, Mrs. Thompson, this kind of case can get very ugly very quickly. Your son and daughter-in-law will probably hire their own attorney, and they'll likely argue that you're an alienating influence who has manipulated Connor against them. Is there any truth to that concern? Sarah studied me for a moment. From what you've told me, it sounds like Connor is responding to genuine dysfunction in his parents' household, not manipulation. From you. But courts see a lot of custody battles where grandparents and parents use children as weapons against each other. You'll need to prove that your motives are about Connor's well-being, not revenge against his parents. What would that look like? It would look like documentation of his emotional distress, evidence of his parents' unreasonable demands and manipulative behavior, and testimony from neutral parties about the family dynamics. It would also look like you being willing to facilitate Connor's relationship with his parents, even if he lives with you. Even if they've been harmful to him? Even then. Unless there's evidence of serious abuse, courts want to preserve parent-child relationships. You'd need to show that you can provide Connor with stability while still encouraging him to work through his issues with his parents. We talked for another hour about the legal process, the likely timeline, and the costs involved. By the time I left Sarah's office, I understood that what Connor and I were contemplating would consume months of our lives and thousands of dollars, with no guarantee of success. But as I drove home through the desert afternoon, I thought about Connor's words. I just want to be able to breathe. I thought about Frank and what he would have done if he had seen his grandson trapped in a household where love was conditional and control was disguised as care. That evening, Connor came over for what we both knew would be our last normal visit for a while. His parents had agreed to let him see me, but only under the condition that I convince him to abandon his plan. To live with me? They want you to talk me out of it, he said as we worked together in Frank's garage, cleaning clay tools we had never learned to use. And what do you want me to do? I want you to file the papers and start the legal process. I want to live with someone who sees me as a person instead of a project. I looked at this young man who had somehow managed to stay clear-sighted despite growing up in a household built on manipulation and control. He deserved better than parents who saw him as an extension of their own egos. Okay, I said. Tomorrow, I'll ask Sarah to start the paperwork. Really? Really? But Connor, once we do this, there's no going back. Your relationship with your parents will probably never be the same. It's already not the same, at least this way. Maybe someday it can be honest. That night, I called Jim to tell him about our decision. The conversation was brief and brutal. You're destroying this family, he said. I'm trying to save the parts of it that are worth saving. Connor is our son, and he's my grandson, and right now, he needs someone who puts his emotional well-being ahead of their own ego. You'll regret this. Maybe. But I'll regret not trying even more. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the woman who had spent months trying to earn her place in Jim and Ashley's household was gone. In her place was someone I was still getting to know. A woman who was willing to fight for what mattered, even when the fight was against her own son. The papers were filed the next week. The battle for Connor's future, and for my right to be part of it, had officially begun. The legal process unfolded like a slow-motion earthquake, reshaping the landscape of our family one hearing at a time. While we waited for court dates and evaluations, Connor continued living with Jim and Ashley under increasingly tense circumstances. They had hired their own attorney, a sharp-dressed man named David Walsh, who specialized in what he called parental rights protection. From what I could gather through Sarah, their strategy was to paint me as a vindictive grandmother exploiting Connor's teenage rebellion to exact revenge on his parents for refusing to let me dominate their household. The atmosphere in their Scottsdale house grew more poisonous by the day. Connor would call me every evening after completing his homework, his voice strained with exhaustion from walking on eggshells all day. Jim and Ashley had begun monitoring his conversations, checking his phone, and questioning him about every interaction we had. They seemed to believe that if they could just isolate him from my influence long enough, he would abandon his plan to live with me and return to being the compliant teenager they remembered. What they failed to understand was that Connor's desire to leave their house wasn't born from my manipulation, but from his own growing awareness of how family relationships should and shouldn't function. He had spent enough time in my home to experience what it felt like to be heard rather than managed, valued rather than controlled. The contrast was stark enough that returning to their household felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit. 3 weeks before our first hearing, Connor had what could only be described as a breakdown. He called me at 2 a.m, sobbing so hard I could barely understand him. "They're trying to make me sign something," he managed to get out between gasps. "A statement saying that you manipulated me and that I want to stay with them." I was out of bed immediately, pulling on clothes while we talked. "Where are you?" "In my room, but they're right outside the door. They said if I don't sign it, They'll know I've been completely brainwashed and they'll have to take more drastic measures. Drastic measures? Dad mentioned something about boarding school, military academy, someplace where I can't be influenced by outside forces until I'm thinking clearly again. The cruelty of it took my breath away. They were willing to ship their own son away rather than examine their own behavior or acknowledge his legitimate concerns about their treatment of both. Him and me. Connor, listen to me carefully. You don't have to sign anything. You don't have to agree to anything that doesn't feel right to you. Can you get to school tomorrow morning? I think so. I'll pick you up after school, and we'll talk to Sarah about what's happening. This kind of pressure isn't okay, and the court needs to know about it. But what if they really do send me away? They can't make major decisions like that without court approval while we have an active custody case. And if they try, it will only prove our point about how they treat you when they don't get their way. The next day, Sarah filed an emergency motion documenting Jim and Ashley's attempts to coerce Connor into recanting his testimony. Judge Martinez was not pleased with this development and issued a temporary restraining order preventing them from pressuring Connor about the case or making any major changes to his living situation without court approval. That evening, Jim called me, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Do you see what you've done?" he demanded. "Do you see how far you've pushed this? Now we have court orders governing how we can talk to our own son in our own house. I see that you tried to intimidate a 16-year-old into signing a false statement to help your legal case," I replied evenly. "I see that when Connor wouldn't comply, you threatened to send him away to military school. We were exploring options for getting him away from your toxic influence. You were threatening to exile your own child because he wouldn't pretend to be someone he's not. He's our son, not yours. Then start acting like it. Start treating him like a person whose feelings and opinions matter, instead of like a problem that needs to be solved or controlled." The conversation ended with Jim hanging up on me, but the damage to their case was already done. The emergency hearing revealed the extent to which they were willing to go to maintain control, and it painted a picture of a household where dissent was met with threats rather than discussion. Connor's relief at having legal protection from his parents' pressure was palpable, but it also marked the point where any hope of family reconciliation began to fade. Jim and Ashley stopped pretending to be concerned about Connor's well-being and focused entirely on winning the legal battle. Their social media posts, which had previously showcased their perfect family life, now hinted at betrayal and ingratitude, painting themselves as victims of manipulation, and Connor as a confused child being used by spiteful adults. The first formal hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 6 months after Connor had first asked to live with me. By then, he had been enduring the hostile environment of his parents' house for nearly 4 months, and the psychological toll was evident. He had lost weight, developed insomnia, and started having anxiety attacks that required medication from his pediatrician. Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, the family therapist appointed by the court to evaluate our situation, had spent weeks interviewing all of us individually and together. Her preliminary report, which would be presented at the hearing, painted a disturbing picture of family dysfunction that went far beyond typical teenage rebellion. Connor exhibits classic signs of emotional stress consistent with living in an environment where his autonomy and self-expression are systematically suppressed, she had written. His parents' insistence on viewing normal adolescent development as pathological defiance has created a household where the child feels he must choose between authenticity and acceptance. The night before the hearing, Connor stayed at my house with court permission. We spent the evening working in Frank's pottery studio, our hands shaping clay while we talked through what would happen the next day. "Are you nervous?" I asked him as we centered a piece of clay on the wheel. "Terrified," he admitted. "Not of the judge or the lawyers, but of what this is going to do to our family. Even if I win, I lose my parents. Even if I get to live with you, they'll probably hate both of us forever. I stopped the wheel and looked at him. This young man who had shown such courage in standing up for himself despite enormous pressure to conform. Connor, I need you to understand something. The family you're afraid of losing doesn't actually exist. The parents you're trying not to hurt have already hurt you, repeatedly and deliberately. You're not destroying anything real by choosing to protect yourself. But they do love me, in their own way. I believe that's true. But love that requires you to disappear isn't love. It's possession. Love that punishes you for having feelings. And opinions isn't love, it's control. Real love wants you to grow and become yourself, not shrink to fit someone else's expectations. He nodded slowly, tears forming in his eyes. I just wish it didn't have to be so hard. I know, sweetheart. I wish that too. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, more like a conference room than the dramatic setting I had seen in movies. Connor sat between Sarah and me, wearing the one good suit we had bought him for the occasion. He looked older than his 16 years, mature beyond his time because of everything he had endured. Across the aisle, Jim and Ashley flanked their attorney, both dressed impeccably, and projecting the image of concerned, responsible parents who were being unfairly attacked by a vindictive ex-family member. Ashley carried a leather portfolio that I suspected contained character references, school records, and other evidence of their parenting competence. Judge Martinez was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and the kind of steady presence that suggested she had presided over countless family tragedies. She reviewed the substantial file of paperwork for several minutes before looking up at all of us gathered in her courtroom. This is an unusual case, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen every possible variation of family dysfunction. We have a 16-year-old requesting to live with his grandmother due to what he describes as emotional distress and manipulation in his parents' home. We have parents who maintain they provide a stable, loving environment and that their son is being influenced by family conflict created by his grandmother. And we have a grandmother who claims to be acting in the child's best interests, while admittedly being in significant dispute with his parents over boundaries and respect. She paused, looking directly at Connor. Young man, I want to hear from you directly, in your own words, why you believe living with your grandmother would be better for your emotional and psychological development. Connor had practiced this moment with Sarah, but sitting in that formal courtroom with everyone's eyes on him, he looked both very young and remarkably determined. Your Honor, my parents aren't bad people, and I don't want anyone to think I'm trying to hurt them or get them in trouble. But they've created a household where love feels conditional on perfect behavior and complete agreement with their decisions. When my grandmother lived with us, they treated her like an employee rather than a family member, expecting her to provide services without respect or appreciation. He paused, gathering his courage to continue. When she chose to return to her own house, they told me she had abandoned our family and didn't love us anymore, which wasn't true. They've taught me that questioning their decisions is disrespectful, that having my own opinions is selfish, and that my value as a family member depends on how well I conform to their expectations. Judge Martinez nodded thoughtfully, making notes as Connor spoke. Can you give me specific examples of how this dynamic has affected you? Yes, ma'am. When I struggled with algebra last year, they hired a tutor but then criticized me for needing help, saying it reflected poorly on our family's academic standards. When I wanted to take art classes instead of additional business courses, they said I was being impractical and not thinking about our family's reputation. When I expressed concerns about how they were treating my grandmother, they said I was being manipulated and needed to learn to think for myself. But then they got angry when my independent thinking led to conclusions they didn't like. Connor's voice grew stronger as he continued. I love my parents, but I can't be myself around them. Every conversation feels like a performance where I have to say the right things to avoid conflict. Every decision I make is evaluated based on how it affects their image, rather than whether it's good for me. Living with my grandmother has shown me what it feels like to be valued for who I am, rather than how well I meet someone else's expectations. Judge Martinez turned to Jim and Ashley. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I'd like to hear your perspective on your son's characterization of your household dynamics. David Walsh stood up, straightening his expensive suit jacket. Your Honor, what we have here is a textbook case of parental alienation being perpetrated by a bitter family member who cannot accept reasonable boundaries. Mrs. Margaret Thompson has been systematically undermining my client's parental authority, since they declined to allow her to manage their household according to her preferences. He gestured toward a stack of documents. My clients have provided extensive documentation of their son's academic achievements, extracurricular involvement, and overall development under their care. Connor has thrived in their structured, supportive environment until his grandmother began filling his head with ideas about oppression and manipulation. Walsh's tone grew more aggressive. What Connor characterizes as conditional love is actually consistent parenting that teaches responsibility, respect, and family loyalty. What he describes as lacking autonomy is actually age-appropriate guidance that prepares him for adult responsibilities. Mrs. Thompson has exploited normal teenage rebellion and convinced Connor that his parents' efforts to raise him with strong values are somehow harmful. Judge Martinez looked skeptical. Mr. Walsh, I've reviewed Dr. Gonzalez's evaluation, and she seems to disagree with your characterization. She found evidence of significant emotional distress in Connor that predates any influence from his grandmother. Dr. Gonzalez's evaluation is based on Connor's self-reporting, which has been tainted by months of exposure to his grandmother's narrative about his parents. A confused teenager is not a reliable witness to family dynamics he doesn't have the maturity to understand. I felt Sarah tense beside me at this dismissal of Connor's credibility, but she remained silent as Walsh continued. Furthermore, Your Honor, Mrs. Thompson's motivation here is clearly retribution for my client's refusal to allow her to control their household management. She moved into their home after being widowed. My clients generously accommodated her presence. But when they attempted to establish reasonable boundaries about household responsibilities and decision-making authority, she became vindictive and began poisoning Connor against them. Judge Martinez looked at me. Mrs. Thompson, I'd like to hear your response to the suggestion that you're using Connor to exact revenge against his parents for not allowing you to control their household. I had thought about this question for months, knowing it would be central to their case against me. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of everyone's attention and the importance of getting this right. Your Honor, I lived in my son's house for 3 months after my husband died, providing full-time housekeeping, cooking, and childcare services while being treated as hired help rather than family. When I chose to return to my own home and resume my independent life, they responded by offering me a written contract that would have formalized my domestic duties in exchange for being allowed to remain part of Connor's life. I could see Judge Martinez's expression shift slightly at this detail, her eyebrows raising in what might have been surprise or disapproval. I declined their contract because I recognized it for what it was, an attempt to purchase my family relationships through unpaid labor. When I chose to maintain my dignity and independence, they retaliated by telling Connor I had abandoned the family and attempting to limit his contact with me, unless I agreed to their terms. I paused, looking directly at Jim and Ashley. Your Honor, I'm not seeking revenge against anyone. I'm trying to provide my grandson with an example of what healthy relationships look like. I'm trying to show him that love doesn't require you to disappear, that family doesn't mean surrendering your autonomy, and that it's possible to care for people without allowing them to exploit that care. Walsh objected. Your Honor, Mrs. Thompson is characterizing normal family cooperation as exploitation. Let me ask you this, Mr. Walsh, Judge Martinez said, her tone sharpening. You mentioned a written contract regarding Mrs. Thompson's role in the household. Can you provide the court with a copy of this document? Walsh looked uncomfortable, glancing back at Jim and Ashley, who whispered something urgent to him. The document was never finalized, Your Honor. It was simply a draft of potential arrangements that was never implemented. I see. But such a document was created and presented to Mrs. Thompson? My clients were attempting to establish clear expectations for a multi-generational living arrangement, similar to many families who choose to live together. What kind of expectations were outlined in this draft? The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Jim stood up, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the questioning. Your Honor, we felt it would be helpful to have written guidelines about things like meal preparation, light housekeeping, and helping with Connor's transportation to activities. We thought it would prevent misunderstandings and make everyone more comfortable. And what was Mrs. Thompson to receive in return for providing these services? She would continue to be part of our family and maintain her relationship with Connor. Judge Martinez set down her pen and looked directly at Jim with an expression that suggested she was not impressed with what she was hearing. Mr. Thompson, are you telling this court that your mother's relationship with her grandson was contingent on her providing domestic services to your household? No, Your Honor, that's not. We didn't mean it that way. Then how did you mean it? Because from where I sit, it sounds like you were requiring your recently widowed mother to earn her place in her own family through unpaid labor. We were just trying to establish some structure and clear expectations. Structure that required her to cook your meals, clean your house, and provide childcare in exchange for access to her grandson? Jim's face was flushed now, and I could see him struggling to find a way to explain their position that didn't sound exactly like what it was. We were offering her a place to live and be part of our daily lives, in exchange for full-time domestic services. We never called it that. What would you call it, Mr. Thompson? The question hung in the air, and I watched my son grapple with the reality of what he and Ashley had done. They had never framed it as employment because that would have required them to acknowledge that they were exploiting me. Instead, they had wrapped it in the language of family cooperation and mutual support, convincing themselves that my labor was a gift I was happy to provide rather than a price I was being forced to pay. Judge Martinez turned to Connor. Son, if you were to live with your grandmother, what kind of relationship would you want to maintain with your parents? Connor had clearly thought about this question extensively. Your Honor, I'd want to have a normal, healthy relationship with them. One where we can talk honestly about things without everything being about whether I'm sufficiently respectful of their authority. I'd want to spend time with them when it feels natural and positive, not because I'm required to, or because they're testing my loyalty. Do you believe your grandmother would interfere with your relationship with your parents? No, ma'am. If anything, she's encouraged me to try to work things out with them. She's never said anything negative about them to me, even when I've been frustrated and angry. She's always suggested that I try to see things from their perspective and communicate directly with them about my concerns. And have you tried to communicate with your parents about your feelings? Connor's expression grew pained. Yes, ma'am, many times. But every time I try to express concerns or feelings they don't like, they tell me I'm being disrespectful or that I'm not mature enough to understand the situation. They want me to trust them completely, but they don't seem to trust me at all. Judge Martinez made extensive notes, then looked at her calendar. I'm going to order a temporary custody arrangement while we conduct a more comprehensive evaluation. Connor will spend weekdays with his grandmother and weekends with his parents for the next 6 weeks. During this time, Dr. Gonzalez will continue her assessment of the family dynamics and provide detailed recommendations to the court. It wasn't everything we had hoped for, but it was a significant step forward. Connor would have a safe, supportive environment during the school week while still maintaining regular contact with Jim and Ashley. More importantly, a qualified professional would be observing all of our interactions and assessing the health of our family relationships. The 6 weeks of temporary custody revealed the stark differences between the two households more clearly than any testimony could have. At my house, Connor thrived. His grades improved dramatically, his anxiety symptoms decreased, and he began to rediscover interests and activities that had been discouraged or dismissed in his parents' home. We established routines based on mutual respect rather than rigid control. Connor did his homework without being supervised or nagged because he understood that his education was his responsibility. He helped with household tasks not because they were assigned to him, but because he was a member of our family team. He talked openly about his feelings and concerns because he knew he would be heard rather than corrected. The weekends with Jim and Ashley were more challenging. They seemed to be trying harder to connect with Connor, but their efforts were often undermined by their inability to let go of their need to manage and control every interaction. They planned elaborate activities and special outings, then grew, frustrated when Connor didn't respond with the level of enthusiasm or gratitude they expected. "It's like they think love is a performance," Connor told me after one particularly difficult weekend. "Like if they just do the right activities and say the right words, I'll forget about everything else and go back to being the kid they want me to be instead of the person I actually am." Dr. Gonzalez conducted extensive interviews with all of us during this period, observing our interactions and assessing the emotional health of our relationships. Her sessions with Jim and Ashley were particularly revealing, as she had a gift for asking simple questions that exposed the underlying assumptions they carried about power, control, and family relationships. "When you say Connor needs to respect your authority," she asked Ashley during one session I was allowed to observe, "what does that look like in practical terms?" "It means not questioning our decisions, trusting that we know what's best for him, accepting our guidance without argument, and contributing positively to the family atmosphere," Ashley replied, as if reciting from a parenting manual. "And what happens when Connor has different opinions or feelings about family decisions that affect him? He can express them appropriately, but ultimately he needs to accept that we're the parents and our decisions are final." "What would inappropriate expression look like to you?" Ashley grew visibly uncomfortable. "Arguing with us, refusing to cooperate with family plans, trying to get other family members to take his side against us, or questioning our motives. So if Connor disagrees with a family decision and wants to discuss his concerns with his grandmother, that would be inappropriate? If he's trying to get her to overrule us or undermine our authority, yes." Dr. Gonzalez made careful notes. "And Mrs. Thompson, when Connor talks to you about his feelings regarding his parents' decisions, how do you typically respond?" "I listen to him," I said. "I ask questions to help him think through the situation and understand different perspectives. Sometimes I encourage him to talk directly with his parents about his concerns. I try to help him develop his own judgment and communication skills." "Do you ever take his side against his parents?" "I take his side as a person who deserves to have his feelings acknowledged and his perspective considered. I don't automatically assume his parents are wrong, but I also don't assume he should accept decisions that significantly affect his life without being allowed to express his thoughts and concerns." The difference in our approaches was stark and revealing. Jim and Ashley saw parenting as a hierarchy where questioning authority was inherently disrespectful and potentially dangerous. I saw it as a relationship where Connor's growing independence and critical thinking skills should be nurtured rather than suppressed. Connor's individual sessions with Dr. Gonzalez seemed to help him articulate feelings and insights he had been struggling to express. When she asked him what he needed from his family relationships, his answer was both simple and profound. "I need to feel like they see me as a real person with my own thoughts and feelings, not just as someone who's supposed to make them look good or feel good about themselves as parents." The 6 weeks passed more quickly than I had expected, and Connor's adjustment to living with me was remarkably smooth. We developed a rhythm of daily life that felt natural and supportive. He had space to be himself without constant evaluation or correction, He could express frustration or confusion without being told he was being disrespectful. He could make age-appropriate decisions without having to justify them to adults who saw independence as a threat to their control. But the weekends with his parents remained difficult and sometimes traumatic. Jim and Ashley seemed to interpret every sign of Connor's growing confidence and autonomy as evidence that I was poisoning him against them. They alternated between trying to win him back with special treatment and punishing him for not being sufficiently grateful for their efforts. One Sunday evening, Connor returned from their house visibly shaken. He had been quiet during dinner, picking at his food and avoiding eye contact. Finally, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "They want me to choose," he said quietly. "They said I can't keep living in two worlds, that I need to decide whether I want to be part of their family or not. They said if I choose to live with you permanently, I shouldn't expect to maintain the same relationship with them." The cruelty of forcing a 16-year-old to choose between his basic emotional needs and his relationship with his parents was breathtaking. They were essentially telling him that their love was conditional on his willingness to surrender his autonomy and return to being the compliant child they preferred. "What did you tell them?" I asked gently. "I told them I didn't want to choose, that I loved them and wanted them in my life, but I couldn't go back to living in a house where I feel like I'm suffocating. I told them I hoped we could find a way to have a relationship that didn't require me to pretend to be someone I'm not." How did they respond? Mom started crying and saying I was breaking her heart. Dad got angry and said I was being manipulated into thinking normal parenting was oppressive. They said if I really loved them, I would trust their judgment and stop letting you turn me against them. The emotional manipulation was so blatant and harmful that I felt sick. They were using Connor's love for them as a weapon against his own well-being, forcing him to choose between his mental health and their approval. Dr. Gonzalez's final evaluation was scheduled for the week before Thanksgiving. All of us gathered in her office to hear her assessment and recommendations, which would heavily influence Judge Martinez's final decision about Connor's living arrangements. "I've spent considerable time with this family over the past several months," Dr. Gonzalez began, "and I've observed some deeply concerning patterns alongside genuine love and care that unfortunately has become distorted by unhealthy power dynamics." She looked directly at Jim and Ashley. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, it's clear that you love Connor and believe you're acting in his best interests. However, your parenting approach has become controlling in ways that are counterproductive to Connor's healthy development as an adolescent moving toward adulthood." Jim started to object, but Dr. Gonzalez held up her hand to continue. "Your tendency to interpret Connor's growing independence and critical thinking as disrespect, rather than normal developmental progress, has created an environment where Connor feels he must choose between authenticity and acceptance. This is particularly problematic during adolescence, when young people are naturally beginning to develop their own identities and value systems." She turned to me. "Mrs. Thompson, you've provided Connor with emotional support and stability during a very difficult period. Your approach to parenting appears to be more developmentally appropriate for an adolescent, allowing space for Connor to express himself while still providing guidance and structure." Finally, she looked at Connor. "Connor, you've demonstrated remarkable maturity and insight throughout this process. Your ability to articulate your needs and feelings shows that you're developing good self-awareness and communication skills. It's clear that you're not simply rebelling against reasonable rules, but responding to family dynamics that don't allow appropriate space for your continued growth and development." Dr. Gonzalez paused, consulting her extensive notes. "My professional recommendation is that Connor continue living primarily with his grandmother, with regular but structured visitation with his parents. I'm also strongly recommending ongoing family therapy to help all parties develop healthier communication patterns and work toward rebuilding trust and understanding." The final court hearing was scheduled for the first week of December, exactly 8 months after Connor had first asked to live with me. By then, The temporary custody arrangement had been in place long enough to demonstrate its benefits clearly. Connor's teachers reported significant improvements in his academic performance, classroom engagement, and overall demeanor. His pediatrician documented the resolution of his anxiety symptoms and sleep problems. Most importantly, Connor himself had grown more confident and articulate about expressing his needs and boundaries. Jim and Ashley made one final attempt to regain custody, with Walsh arguing that Dr. Gonzalez had been biased in favor of the grandmother, and that Connor was too young to make such a significant decision about his living arrangements. They presented character witnesses who testified to their good intentions and their love for Connor, but they couldn't address the fundamental issue of how their controlling behavior had affected their son's emotional well-being. Their case was further undermined by their own behavior during the temporary custody period. Dr. Gonzalez had documented several instances where they had attempted to use guilt, emotional manipulation, and threats to pressure Connor into changing his mind about living with me. These tactics had only reinforced Connor's conviction that he needed distance from their household to develop into a healthy, independent adult. When Judge Martinez announced her decision, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and hope. Relief that Connor would be safe and supported in an environment where he could continue to grow and thrive. Sadness that our family had fractured so severely that legal intervention had been necessary. Hope that perhaps, with time and continued therapy, we might eventually find a way to heal the damage and rebuild healthier relationships. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, including the extensive evaluation by Dr. Gonzalez and the documented improvements in Connor's well-being during his time with his grandmother, it is this court's determination that Connor's best interests are served by continuing to live with Mrs. Thompson, Judge Martinez announced. This arrangement will include regular supervised visitation with his parents and mandatory family therapy for all parties. The situation will be reviewed in 1 year to assess how all family members are adjusting to this arrangement. Connor squeezed my hand under the table, his relief palpable. Across the aisle, Ashley was crying softly while Jim stared straight ahead, his face a mask of anger and defeat. I felt sorry for them in that moment, understanding that their pain was real even if their methods had been harmful. As we left the courthouse that day, Connor was uncharacteristically quiet, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. It wasn't until we were driving home through the desert afternoon that he finally spoke. "Do you think they'll ever forgive me?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But Connor, forgiveness is something they have to choose for themselves. You can't control their reaction to your decision to protect your own emotional well-being. Do you think I made the right choice?" I pulled over into a parking lot and turned to look at him, this remarkable young man who had shown such courage in advocating for himself, despite enormous pressure to conform. "I think you made the only choice that allowed you to remain true to yourself while still loving your parents. I think you chose to prioritize your mental health and personal growth over keeping an artificial peace, and I think that's a lesson that will serve you well for the rest of your life." The months that followed were a period of significant adjustment for all of us. Connor flourished in the stability and emotional safety of my home in ways that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. His grades didn't just improve, they soared. He discovered a passion for pottery that connected him to Frank's memory, while also allowing him to express his own creativity. He joined the school's debate team and found that he had a natural talent for articulating complex ideas and arguing persuasively for his positions. Most importantly, Connor began to develop the kind of self-confidence that comes from being valued for who you are rather than what you can do for others. He learned to trust his own judgment, to express his opinions without fear of punishment, and to maintain his boundaries even when doing so was uncomfortable or inconvenient. The mandatory family therapy sessions were challenging and often painful, but they gradually began to produce small breakthroughs. Jim and Ashley were resistant at first, viewing the therapy as another imposition rather than an opportunity for healing. But as months passed and they saw Connor thriving in ways he never had under their roof, they slowly began to question some of their fundamental assumptions about parenting and control. The turning point came during a session in late spring, almost a year after Connor had moved in with me. Dr. Gonzalez had been working patiently with all of us to develop better communication skills and to help Jim and Ashley understand how their need for control had been driven more by their own anxieties than by Connor's actual needs. "I want to try something different today," Dr. Gonzalez said. "I want each of you to tell Connor one thing you've learned about him over the past year that you didn't know before." Ashley went first, her voice shaking with emotion. "I learned that you're much stronger and more thoughtful than I gave you credit for. I always saw your questions and concerns as problems to be solved rather than insights to be considered. I realize now that I was so focused on protecting you from making mistakes that I didn't allow you to develop your own judgment." Jim was next, and his confession was even more revealing. "I learned that my need to control everything in our family wasn't actually about what was best for you. It was about my own fear of failure as a father. I thought if I could just manage every aspect of your life, I could guarantee your success and happiness. But I see now that I was preventing you from becoming the person you're meant to be." When it was Connor's turn, his response surprised everyone. "I learned that you both love me more than I understood, but that your love got mixed up with fear and control in ways that made it hard for me to feel safe being myself. I also learned that it's possible to love someone and still need space from them to grow into who you're supposed to become." The session ended with the first genuine embrace between Connor and his parents since the custody battle had begun. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. Over the summer, Connor got his first job at a local art supply store, earning money for college while learning valuable lessons about responsibility and independence. I started volunteering at a women's shelter, teaching pottery classes to women who were rebuilding their lives after leaving abusive relationships. The parallel between their situations and my own experience with Jim and Ashley's controlling behavior was not lost on me. Connor and I also began working together on a project that had been brewing in my mind for months, converting Frank's garage pottery studio into a community space where people could come to learn ceramics and other crafts. It became a place where creativity and healing intersected, where people could work with their hands while processing difficult emotions and experiences. Jim and Ashley's visits gradually became less tense and more authentic. They were learning to relate to Connor as the young adult he was becoming, rather than the child they remembered. Ashley even began taking pottery classes with us, discovering a creative outlet she had never allowed herself to explore when she was focused entirely on maintaining her perfect family image. The changes in our family dynamics rippled outward in unexpected ways. Connor's friends began spending more time at our house, drawn by the atmosphere of acceptance and genuine conversation. Several of them confided in me about their own struggles with controlling parents, and I found myself becoming an informal counselor and advocate for young people who were fighting for their right to be themselves. One evening, in late August, as Connor and I were cleaning up after a particularly successful pottery session with a group of his friends, he looked at me thoughtfully. "Grandma, can I ask you something I've been wondering about?" "Always. Do you ever regret fighting for me? I mean, it cost you your relationship with Dad and Ashley, at least the way it used to be. It cost you a lot of money and stress and heartbreak. Was it worth all that?" I paused in my cleaning, considering his question seriously. The past year had indeed been costly in every way he mentioned. My relationship with Jim had been fundamentally altered, perhaps permanently. Ashley still viewed me with suspicion and resentment, despite the progress we had made in therapy. I had spent thousands of dollars on legal fees and countless hours in emotionally draining court proceedings and therapy sessions. But I looked at Connor, healthy and confident, and growing into the kind of thoughtful, independent young man any parent would be proud of. And the answer was crystal clear. "Connor, For most of my adult life, I defined my worth by how much I could sacrifice for other people. I measured my value by how useful I was, how much I was needed, how many problems I could solve for the people I loved. And somewhere along the way, I forgot that I was a person with my own needs and dreams and boundaries. I sat down beside him on the old sofa Frank had used for taking breaks between pottery sessions. This past year has taught me that love isn't supposed to require you to disappear. Real love sees you as a complete person, not just a service provider or a reflection of someone else's success. It values your thoughts and feelings and boundaries, not just your willingness to sacrifice everything for others. Connor nodded, understanding more than most 17-year-olds would about the complexity of family relationships and personal growth. Fighting for you meant fighting for both of us, I continued. It meant saying that we both deserve relationships, where we're seen and valued for who we are, not what we can do for other people, or how well we conform to someone else's expectations. I reached over and squeezed his hand. So yes, it was absolutely worth it. Not just because you're thriving now, but because we both learned that it's possible to love people without losing yourself in the process. That night, after Connor had gone upstairs to finish his college application essays, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea and thought about how dramatically my life had changed. 18 months earlier, I had been a grieving widow desperately trying to find my place in a family that saw me only as a source of unpaid labor. I had been willing to sign contracts and surrender my autonomy just to maintain proximity to the people I loved. Now I was a woman who had fought a legal battle and won, who had provided sanctuary for a young person who needed safety and support, who had learned to set boundaries and maintain them even when doing so was difficult. I had discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed, and developed a sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on other people's approval or needs. The desert night was warm and clear, filled with the familiar sounds of crickets and the distant hum of the city. I felt peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years, not because my life was perfect or without ongoing challenges, but because it was finally completely mine. Connor's senior year of high school brought new developments that tested all of our growth and healing. He was accepted to Arizona State University with a partial scholarship, planning to study art therapy with a focus on working with adolescents and families in crisis. His choice of major was clearly influenced by his own experiences, and I was proud of his desire to help others navigate similar challenges. Jim and Ashley surprised everyone by offering to contribute to Connor's college expenses, despite the financial strain it would create for them. It was a gesture that signaled their commitment to rebuilding their relationship with their son, even if it meant acknowledging that his path forward would be different from what they had originally envisioned. "We want to support your education," Jim told Connor during one of their weekly visits. "Even if we don't completely understand all your choices. We're learning that being good parents means helping you become who you're meant to be, not who we think you should be." Connor's high school graduation was a bittersweet milestone for all of us. He had worked hard to overcome the academic challenges created by the emotional turmoil of his junior year, and he graduated with honors despite everything he had endured. Both Jim and Ashley were there, sitting in the same row as Betty and me, united in our pride for Connor's achievements. At the graduation party we held in my backyard, I watched Connor move easily between different groups of people: his friends from school, his pottery class companions, his parents, and various neighbors who had become part of our extended community. He had developed the kind of social confidence that comes from knowing you're accepted for who you are, and it was beautiful to see. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had gone home, Jim approached me as I was cleaning up the kitchen. We hadn't had a private conversation in months, and I wasn't sure what to expect. "Mom, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Several apologies, actually." I stopped what I was doing and looked at him, seeing genuine remorse in his expression, for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. "I'm sorry for taking advantage of your generosity when you lived with us. I'm sorry for treating you like hired help instead of my mother. I'm sorry for trying to control Connor in ways that were harmful to him. And I'm sorry for fighting so hard against what was obviously best for everyone involved. His voice grew thick with emotion. I was so afraid of losing control, of admitting that I might be wrong about anything, that I almost lost both of you permanently. The irony is that by trying to hold on so tightly, I was pushing away the people I love most. I felt my own eyes filling with tears. Jim, I know you love us. I never doubted that. But love without respect isn't sustainable, and control isn't the same thing as care. I'm learning that, he said. It's harder than I thought it would be, letting go of the need to manage everything and everyone. But watching Connor thrive this past year has shown me that he's capable of making good decisions when he's given the space and support to do so. We talked for another hour that night, the longest honest conversation we had shared in years. It wasn't a complete healing of all the damage that had been done, but it was a significant step toward rebuilding our relationship on a healthier foundation. Ashley's journey toward acceptance and change was slower and more complicated. Her identity had been so wrapped up in the image of the perfect family that Connor's choice to live elsewhere felt like a public repudiation of her worth as a mother. The family therapy sessions revealed that her controlling behavior stemmed from deep insecurities about her own value and lovability. I kept thinking that if I could just make everything perfect enough, if I could control all the variables, then people would have to love and approve of me, she confessed during one particularly emotional session. I didn't realize that I was making it impossible for people to love the real me, because I never let them see who that was. Her breakthrough came during Connor's senior year, when she decided to take a break from social media and focus on developing genuine interests and relationships instead of maintaining her online persona. She enrolled in college courses for the first time since Connor was born, rediscovering her love of literature and writing. I want to be someone Connor can respect and relate to as an adult, she told me one afternoon when she came by to pick up Connor for their monthly dinner together. Not just someone who gave birth to him, but someone who adds value to his life because of who I am as a person. The transformation in Ashley was remarkable to witness. As she developed her own sense of identity and purpose outside of her role as a mother and wife, she became more relaxed and authentic in her relationships with everyone, including Connor and me. Connor's 18th birthday marked a legal milestone that officially ended the court's involvement in our family situation. But by then, the arrangements had become so natural and successful that no one wanted to change them. He would continue living with me through his college years, visiting Jim and Ashley regularly, and maintaining the kind of relationship with his parents that was based on mutual respect rather than obligation or control. The birthday celebration was small and intimate, held in Frank's old pottery studio, which had been transformed into a bright, welcoming space filled with the work of many different artists and creators. Connor had specifically requested that we include some of Frank's original pieces in the display, wanting to honor the grandfather who had inadvertently provided the foundation for his own artistic development. As Connor blew out the candles, on his cake, surrounded by family and friends who loved and supported him, I thought about all the battles that had been fought to reach this moment of peace and celebration. The legal proceedings, the therapy sessions, the difficult conversations, and the gradual rebuilding of trust had all been necessary steps in creating space for authentic relationships to flourish. "What did you wish for?" Betty asked Connor as he cut the cake. "I wished for all of us to keep growing and learning together," he said, looking around at the assembled group. "I wished for the courage to keep being honest about who I am and what I need, even when it's difficult. And I wished for the wisdom to love people well without losing myself in the process." His words encapsulated everything we had all learned through this challenging journey. Love didn't require martyrdom or self-erasure. Family didn't mean surrendering your individual identity. Support didn't have to come at the cost of authenticity or autonomy. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Connor and I found ourselves alone in the studio, surrounded by the evidence of creativity and growth and healing. He was putting away supplies while I wiped down the pottery wheels, both of us comfortable in the familiar rhythm of cleaning up after a session of making something beautiful together. "Grandma," he said suddenly, "I have something I want to tell you." I looked up from my cleaning, curious about his serious tone. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened over the past couple of years, and I realized that you didn't just save me from a bad situation. You taught me something that's going to affect the rest of my life." "What's that?" "You taught me that it's possible to love people deeply without allowing them to diminish you. You showed me that standing up for yourself isn't selfish or mean it's necessary for having real relationships instead of fake ones. You demonstrated that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's harmful behavior, even when they're family." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But most importantly, you showed me what it looks like to believe that you're worth fighting for. Not because of what you can do for other people, but because of who you are as a person." I felt tears starting to flow down my cheeks. "Connor, you fought for yourself too. You were brave enough to ask for what you needed, even when it meant disappointing people you loved. You were strong enough to maintain your boundaries even under enormous pressure. You taught me just as much as I taught you. Maybe that's what real family is supposed to be," he said thoughtfully. "People who help each other become their best selves, not people who require you to shrink so they can feel bigger." That night, after Connor had gone to bed, I sat in Frank's old recliner with a photo album from our early years together. I found a picture of Jim as a little boy, maybe 5 years old, grinning at the camera with dirt on his face and joy in his eyes. He had been such a curious, affectionate child, full of questions and enthusiasm for life. I wondered when he had learned to equate love with control, when he had started believing that managing other people was the same as caring for them. I thought about the patterns that had been passed down through generations, the unconscious, assumptions about power and relationships that had shaped all of our behavior. But I also thought about the new patterns we were creating, the healthier ways of loving and supporting each other that Connor would carry forward into his own adult relationships. The cycle of control and manipulation that had characterized so much of our family history was being broken, replaced by something more sustainable and authentic. As Connor began his freshman year at ASU, living at home with me and commuting to campus, our household settled into new rhythms that accommodated his growing independence while maintaining our close connection. He was majoring in art therapy as planned, with a minor in family studies, and his professors were impressed by his maturity and insight into family dynamics. His relationship with Jim and Ashley continued to evolve and improve, though it looked very different from what any of us had originally expected. They had learned to appreciate Connor for who he was becoming rather than trying to mold him into their predetermined expectations. He had learned to maintain his boundaries while still engaging with them in ways that were meaningful and positive. The mandatory family therapy had officially ended, but all of us chose to continue meeting with Dr. Gonzalez periodically to work through ongoing challenges and celebrate progress. These sessions had become less about crisis management and more about continued growth and understanding. During one session in Connor's sophomore year, Dr. Gonzalez asked each of us to reflect on what we had learned from the entire experience. "I learned that being a parent means preparing your child to live successfully without you, not trying to make them dependent on your approval and management," Ashley said. "I learned that my child's happiness and authenticity are more important than my comfort or my image as a mother." Jim nodded in agreement. "I learned that respect is something you earn through your behavior, not something you can demand because of your title or position. I learned that trust is built through consistency and honesty, not through control and manipulation." When it was my turn, I thought carefully about how to articulate the profound changes in my understanding of myself and my relationships. "I learned that I'm allowed to take up space in my own life," I said. "I learned that my needs and feelings and boundaries matter, not just as tools for serving other people better, but as essential parts of who I am as a human being. I learned that saying no to exploitation isn't selfish, it's necessary for having authentic relationships. Connor's reflection was the most poignant of all. I learned that love doesn't hurt. Real love doesn't require you to become smaller or quieter or more compliant. Real love wants you to grow and flourish and become fully yourself, even when that's inconvenient or challenging for other people. As Connor moved through his college years, our community pottery studio became increasingly popular and successful. We hosted workshops for families in crisis, support groups for people rebuilding their lives after difficult relationships, and art therapy sessions for adolescents struggling with similar issues to what Connor had experienced. The studio became a place where people could work with their hands while processing difficult emotions, where creativity and healing intersected in powerful ways. Connor often assisted with the teenage groups, sharing his story and providing peer support for young people who were fighting for their right to be authentic in environments that demanded conformity. On Connor's 21st birthday, we held a special celebration that marked not just his coming of age, but the completion of his transformation from a controlled, anxious teenager into a confident, independent young adult. Jim and Ashley were both there, no longer the people who had tried to manage every aspect of his life, but parents who had learned to love and support without possessing or controlling. The party was held in our backyard, strung with lights and filled with people who had been part of our journey. Betty, who had been my constant supporter and advisor. Dr. Gonzalez, who had helped all of us learn healthier ways of relating. Connor's friends and classmates, neighbors who had become extended family, and participants from our pottery workshops who had found healing and community in our studio. As Connor stood to make a toast, I looked around at this gathered community of people who had learned to love and support each other without conditions or manipulation, and I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the courage we had all found to fight for something better. 3 years ago, Connor began, I thought I had to choose between loving my family and being myself. I thought those were mutually exclusive options, that I could either be authentic or accepted, but not both. He looked around at all of us, his expression warm with affection and gratitude. What I've learned is that real love doesn't require you to make that choice. Real love wants you to be fully yourself, and it creates space for that authenticity, even when it's challenging or uncomfortable. He raised his glass toward me. To my grandmother, who taught me that it's possible to love people deeply while still maintaining your own identity and boundaries. Who showed me that standing up for yourself isn't about being against other people, but about being for your own truth and integrity. Then he turned toward Jim and Ashley, and to my parents, who loved me enough to learn new ways of showing that love, who were willing to examine their own behavior and change patterns that weren't serving any of us well. Who chose growth over comfort, even when it was difficult. Finally, he addressed the entire group. To all of us, for creating a community where people can be themselves without fear, where love is expressed through support rather than control, and where healing happens through connection and creativity. As we raised our glasses together, I thought about Frank and how proud he would have been of the family we had become. Not the perfect, controlled family that Ashley had once tried to create for social media, but a real family with real relationships, based on mutual respect and authentic love. The evening ended with Connor and me working side by side in the pottery studio, teaching a small group of his friends how to center clay on the wheel, watching him guide their hands and encourage their efforts. I saw the teacher and healer he was becoming, someone who would help others find their own paths to authenticity and self-respect. You know what I love most about pottery? Connor said to his friends as they worked. The clay doesn't lie. You can't force it into shapes it doesn't want to take. You have to work with its natural properties, support its structure, be patient with its process. And when you do that, when you respect what it is and what it needs, it becomes something beautiful. One of his friends laughed. Are you talking about clay or people? Connor grinned. Both. Definitely both. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and Connor was upstairs studying for his finals, I sat in the quiet studio surrounded by the evidence of so many people's creative journeys. Bowls and vases and sculptures in various stages of completion, each one unique, each one the result of patient work and respect for the material's inherent nature. I thought about the woman I had been 2 years earlier, so desperate to maintain her place in her family that she was willing to sign contracts and surrender her autonomy. That woman seemed like a stranger to me now, someone I could barely remember being. The woman I had become was someone who knew her own worth, who could love deeply without disappearing, who had learned that boundaries weren't barriers to love, but foundations for authentic relationships. She was someone who had fought for what mattered and won, not through defeating others, but through refusing to defeat herself. As I turned off the lights and locked up the studio, I whispered a thank you to Frank, whose pottery wheel had become the foundation for so much healing and growth. His belief in the importance of creating beauty with your own hands had evolved into something larger, an understanding that we are all works in progress, deserving of patience and respect, and the space to become who we're meant to be. The next morning, Connor bounded downstairs with news that would mark the beginning of yet another chapter in our ongoing story. "Grandma, I got accepted to graduate school," he announced, waving a letter from the university. "They want me to develop a research project on art therapy interventions for adolescents from controlling family environments." I hugged him tightly, proud of his academic achievements, but even prouder of his commitment to helping others navigate challenges similar to what he had experienced. "There's more," he said, grinning. "They want me to present my preliminary research at a national conference on family therapy. And guess who they want me to bring as a co-presenter?" I looked at him quizzically. "You. They want you to talk about the grandparents' perspective on family healing and the role of alternative caregivers in supporting adolescent development." The idea of speaking publicly about our experiences was both thrilling and terrifying, but I realized it was a natural extension of the work we had been doing in our community pottery studio. If our story could help other families find healthier ways of loving and supporting each other, then sharing it was not just an opportunity, but a responsibility. "I'd be honored," I told Connor, "as long as you promise to be patient with me when I get nervous about speaking in front of academics." "Grandma, you faced down lawyers and judges and fought for what you believed in. I think you can handle a room full of therapists." As we planned for this new adventure, I reflected on how far all of us had traveled from that day when Connor first asked to live with me. We had moved from a family system based on control and conditional love to one founded on respect and authentic connection. We had learned that real strength comes not from dominating others, but from knowing yourself well enough to maintain your boundaries while still remaining open to love and growth. The road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges and opportunities for continued learning. Connor would graduate from college, begin his own career, and eventually build his own family relationships. Jim and Ashley would continue their own journey of growth and healing. I would keep discovering new aspects of myself and new ways to contribute to my community. But we would face these future challenges with tools and insights we hadn't possessed before. The knowledge that love doesn't require sacrifice of self, that boundaries are acts of self-respect rather than selfishness, and that authentic relationships are worth fighting for even when the fight is difficult and costly. Standing in my kitchen that morning, watching Connor prepare for another day of classes and growth, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've made choices that align with your values, even when those choices were hard. I had learned to love without losing myself, to give without being depleted, and to fight for what mattered without becoming bitter or resentful. The desert sun was already intense, promising another day of brilliant heat and clear skies. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the back porch, looking at the garden Frank and I had planted so many years ago, now thriving under Connor's and my care. In a few hours, Connor would come home from school with stories about his classes and plans for his research project. Betty would probably stop by with gossip from the neighborhood and advice I didn't know I needed. The pottery studio would fill with people working on their own creative projects and healing journeys. It was a good life, built on a foundation of authentic relationships and mutual respect. It was the life I had fought for, the life Connor deserved, and the life that proved it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them. Out!